Okay.
So you have a big day ahead, and I really do appreciate you coming on in the first place. So let's just do the intro. Last year, the United States imposed sanctions on Venezuela, as we have all been following. This was in early 2019. This was in an effort to oust socialist President Nicolas Maduro. But today, Maduro remains in power. The Trump administration, well, they hate that, let's say. They're frustrated that their imperialist policies seem not to be working, I would say, in part thanks to the work of CODEPINK. Medea Benjamin is with us now, right before heading to a CODEPINK protest of Elliot Abrams, the State Department Special Envoy for Venezuela Policy. Medea is the co-founder of the women-led peace group CODEPINK and the co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange. You have been an advocate for social justice for more than 40 years, and I'm very, very happy that you could join us today. Thanks for being here.
Good to be on with you.
Medea, can you give us a general update on where we are in terms of what's happening in Venezuela?
Well, as you said, the U.S. government is not happy with the Maduro government and was not happy with the Chavez government before him, and was always trying to get rid of governments with a socialist bent to them that were not open, totally open for business for U.S. corporations. And so as part of their plan to overthrow the Maduro government, they've imposed these really brutal sanctions. And I don't think most Americans have any idea that the US has sanctions on so many countries and how much these are a form of collective punishment, or as others call it, a form of economic warfare. But it really is a silent war that's going on because it doesn't affect the leaders of the country so much as it affects the ordinary people. And it makes it harder for people to get food, to get medicines, to get access to basic goods. It makes the prices skyrocket. There was already an economic crisis in Venezuela due to the precipitous decline in the price of oil, as well as government mismanagement, but that was made infinitely worse by the sanctions. And those continue to plague the majority of Venezuelans today. And on top of that, Elliot Abrams, the evil man that he is trying to put more pressure on Venezuela, increase the sanctions, but also a lot of ominous talk about military collective military agreements that he has just made with the neighboring countries of Brazil and Colombia. And he said that the maximum pressure campaign of the US government against Venezuela has only been about halfway there. And there are more measures to come. And we are worried that they're talking about something like a naval blockade, which is an act of war.
And what would that, first of all, when we hear in the mainstream media what the people of Venezuela are going through, it's always blamed on Maduro and his socialist policies. But what percentage of this do you believe is actually, that the U.S. Sanctions can be responsible for?
It's impossible to divide it up like that, Juliana, because, once the sanctions are imposed, it becomes a vicious circle. And because the government has to find other ways to get its oil out, the U.S. stops shipments of oil. The U.S. blocks them from doing trade. They have to look for other ways of doing trade. It means that the government really has the upper hand in terms of business transactions that other businesses don't have. And so that makes it more of a top-down situation. I mean, it is a vicious circle. And so I think it's really duplicitous when the people like Elliot Abrams and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, say that they care about the Venezuelan people, and that's why they're supporting the self-proclaimed President Juan Guaido. It's ridiculous, because if they cared about the Venezuelan people, they would stop these sanctions, and they would stop this blatant interference in the internal affairs of Venezuela. In the 1800s, we had something called the Monroe Doctrine, which said that Latin America was the US backyard and no other countries outside the region could get involved. And really, it was the US had the right to control the governments in power. And today they're talking about Monroe Doctrine openly again. In fact, people within the State Department talk about Monroe Doctrine 2.0. And we're saying that the Monroe Doctrine was always an imperial policy designed to benefit narrow US corporate interests and not the people of Latin America. And it still is the same thing today.
We have some questions coming in from the chat. From T. Lurker, does Medea find it ironic that the United States puts sanctions on Venezuela, which are meant to damage the country's economy, and then uses Venezuela's troubled economy as a reason for further aggression?
Well, yes, exactly. It is. It's hypocritical and it's cruel because yes, the Venezuelan economy is a mess, and that's being used now to tarnish Bernie Sanders with the label of socialism and saying we don't want to be like Venezuela. But what they don't say in that is that the U.S. is to a large extent the cause of those problems. And so whoever sent that in understands that this is a policy designed to make the people of Venezuela suffer, just like the sanctions on Iran, Cuba, North Korea. They're all designed to make the people miserable with the idea that they'll be so miserable they'll rise up against their governments. The problem is, we've had these policies in place in Cuba since the 1960s, in Iran since 1979, and now several years in the case of Venezuela. It doesn't change the government. It just makes the government double down, and it makes the people really suffer.
Medea, talk about the protest you're about to attend in an hour, which we really appreciate you being able to be here with us, by the way. Can't tell you how much. Who's the target? Why is it important to be there? And how can people support the action if they can't be there physically?
Well, there's not many times we get to directly confront the people who make these awful imperial policies. And Elliot Abrams, for your listeners, if you don't know about him, do a quick Google and you'll find that he is really an evil man. He not only looks the part of being evil, he has the history of it. And he was in charge of US policies around Latin America and Central America during the days of the Mozote massacre in El Salvador. He has been trying to undermine the Cuban economy for decades. He has been involved in supporting the death squads in Guatemala under Rios Montt. And he has been in support of the coup in Venezuela from the time of 2002, when there was a briefly successful coup against the Chavez government that was overturned by the people. So he has a very sordid history, and he has now been made the special envoy for Venezuela. I would say special envoy against Venezuela. And so we want to confront him together with some of our friends from Venezuela to talk about how his policies are hurting the people.
What do you make of the fact that the Venezuela policy gets very little coverage? What's happening between the two countries? It's all coronavirus.
Yeah, right. There's always something in the United States that is taking up almost all of the airwaves. And it's the elections, which are really important and deserve the time, although I wish they would be more fair in the way they cover them. And now it's the coronavirus, but it's always something. And, it makes the American people very ignorant when it comes to foreign policy. And then this, too, is a vicious circle, because then foreign policy is lower down on the list when it comes to the issues that people seem to care about. And yet we have a Pentagon that sucks up over half of our discretionary funds and keeps us in these endless wars. And we have these policies where sanctions are seen as a non-violent way, an alternative to war, when they're really a part of economic warfare. But the people don't know about them in the United States, that is. Of course, everybody in Venezuela knows about it. And so the people don't care about it. I would also say, Juliana, that there's a real problem in this country that people are not taught compassion, whether it's compassion for people living in poverty right here in the United States, or people who don't have health care, or it's compassion for people thousands of miles away. That is a muscle that has not been strengthened. I would say perhaps on purpose, because the ethos is really, especially under Donald Trump, just in it for myself, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that kind of thing. And so it's very, what we have is a situation where Americans don't know and so don't seem to care very much about foreign policy.
Can you talk a little bit, and this is a question from Slayist78, about China's Belt and Road Initiative, and will it help Venezuela?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is a series of transportation, roads, and bridges, and things that are being used all over the world to help places that are more isolated. And I would say that both China and Russia have been allies of the Maduro government and have, to some extent, eased the pain. But the US is putting pressure on both of them. And for these big countries, it's interesting that even they succumb to a lot of the pressure, and they have to do their own calculations about whether it's worth standing up to the United States on this issue when there are so many other issues they have to stand up to the Trump administration on. So we can't really count on China and Russia to totally counteract the negative impact of US policies. And one other policy that is just a brand new one that is really hitting Venezuela hard is the war that the Saudi Crown Prince has just launched with Russia and other oil producing countries.
I was going to just ask you about that.
Oh, yeah. Well, flooding the market with oil and the price plummeting. And that is really affecting Venezuela at
I
a
just
time when it's
noticed
already down.
the reporting on that is, oh, they had to do it. They somehow the reporting was, oh, because of the market shifting, because of the coronavirus, Saudi Arabia had to do that. Is the media not reporting accurately on Saudi Arabia's kind of aggression toward using their flooding of the oil market?
The media never reports accurately on Saudi Arabia. If it did, I don't think the US government would be allowed to be an ally of Saudi Arabia. It's an evil, repressive regime, one of the worst in the whole world. And this present oil price war that is launched against Russia is definitely not necessary, and is not only causing problems in the oil market, but in causing problems in the global economy. In fact, a lot of the problems in the US stock market was because of that, or is because of that. So it's the US ally of Mohammed bin Salman, who is this rash 34-year-old crown prince de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, thinks he can get away with whatever he wants, from chopping up a Washington Post journalist to creating havoc in the global economy. And unfortunately, it seems that he is right. He can get away with it.
We have questions coming in from the chat, so I'm looking into those, and I do really appreciate you being here with us today. Medea, we talked before about Iran and the sanctions that the U.S. has placed on Iran, and the different, the crushing burden that puts on the people of Iran. Do you have any insight? And now Iran is hit with the coronavirus. Do you have any insight on the interaction between these different dynamics in that country?
Well, yes, this is another example where the sanctions have destroyed the healthcare system of Iran, which actually had a very good healthcare system. And with keeping medicines and medical equipment from reaching the country, even though humanitarian aid is supposed to be exempt, it's not, because the banks don't want to deal with Iran, the shipping companies don't want to deal, the insurance companies don't want to deal. So even before the coronavirus, there have been shortages of life-saving medicines like cancer medicines and medicines for diabetes. And now it's made it much worse. So I would say that this is a time when we should be putting pressure on our government to say that these sanctions were always affecting the ordinary people of Iran, but now they're affecting the health of the world, because Iran has borders with so many other countries. And we've seen from coronavirus that this is not something that can be stopped by borders. So whether it's for the health of the Iranian people or the entire region, the US should lift those sanctions.
Absolutely. Back to some of the things happening here on the home front, and I'm pummeling you with questions because I know you have to leave. um, the upcoming election, the upcoming primaries that we have, I haven't really heard one word about foreign policy in the primary. Is that unusual to, not really talk foreign policy in the primary and wait until the general election between parties to talk foreign policy? Or it's shocking to me that we haven't discussed that very much.
Well, as we said earlier, it is part of this vicious circle. If the American people don't care very much about foreign policy, then the candidates don't get asked enough about those policies. We have been part of a campaign to go to every all of the campaigns, asking them what would they do about the Pentagon budget, because all of the candidates had made statements about the Pentagon budget being bloated, but they don't have plans about what they would cut and what they would use that money for. And so we have been pushing them all on that. And then in terms
Have you gotten any satisfactory answers?
well, Elizabeth Warren was the only one who actually came up with something concrete, which is she said she'd cut what's called the overseas contingency operations. And that's sort of the slush fund for the Pentagon to wage wars. And that would be cut by, it's a $80 billion slush fund. And she talked about saving $800 billion over the course of a decade. Others would not come up with specific things like that. But they do say, like Bernie Sanders, in a very inspirational way, saying, wouldn't it be nice if the countries of the world took the $1.8 trillion they spend every year in weapons and use that to fight the real fight, which is climate change. And all of the Democratic candidates have been against the US policy in Iran, call for a rejoining of the Iran nuclear deal. But they don't talk about the sanctions and the need to lift those sanctions.
What can our viewers do to get involved in the fight against US imperialism?
Well, of course, one of the things is to go to the website of codepink.org, sign up. We have really wonderful weekly alerts that we educate people, but give them ideas of things to do. And if there's any kind of local organizations in your city to join, that's great. You can always make a CODEPINK chapter in your city. We are seeing an uptick now in the anti-war movement after it kind of died under Obama. Now with the in the beginning of the year, when there was that terrible threat of real military conflict with Iran. So it is important that people get involved, whether it's with CODEPINK or any other organizations. We're also trying to get the environmental groups and gun violence groups and all of these other great movements to include war in their agenda. And
how hard has that been?
well, you
Are
know,
they open to it?
On one level, they're open to saying that if we could slash the Pentagon budget by $300 billion, which is what the Poor People's Campaign is calling for, that would be a lot of money to put towards things like the Green New Deal.
Yeah. So that must encourage them to kind of get on board. That's very good. Medea, final thoughts here on, can you give us your perspective on how dangerous Donald Trump has been in terms of foreign policy?
Well, it's been a tremendous increase in the Pentagon budget, and his bragging about how he's built up the quote devastated military, but it's always been a military that is bigger than the next 10 countries combined. And he has talked about ending the wars, but he hasn't ended them. In fact, he's put about 16,000 more troops in the Middle East. I hope the peace plan in Afghanistan works, but I have my grave doubts, given that there's not even a government in Afghanistan to negotiate with. There's two governments. And he talked about getting the troops out of Syria, but actually didn't do that. And then I think the worst thing is really what he's done with Iran, reverse the progress that was made under Obama with the nuclear deal and put us on a collision course for yet another war in the Middle East, which is something we really have to stop.
Why would he do that? I'm still mad. Just, it just doesn't seem sane. It doesn't seem
Yeah.
sane. It seems vindictive and petty against former President Obama and
Well, it's
potentially.
also doing the bidding of Israel and Saudi Arabia, unfortunately. But thank you for having me on, and
thank you so much.
for
And
your interest in these issues.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you coming on. We will send you the link to this if you want to share it around. And I hope you'll come back. Good luck at your action. We will follow the action that you do and report on it.
Terrific. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.